Logged on. I'm Céline Laurent. I'm a professor with CREVAC in Western University. On behalf of the Learning Network, I'd like to welcome you to this fourth seminar, which is called Rethinking Child Welfare Services, Trauma-Informed Approaches. I am currently on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Attawandaron. These lands are linked to the 1796 London Township and Sombra treaties and the One Spoon Bowl Pact. Wherever you are today, I invite you to think about the traditional lands you are on and join us in recognizing and thanking the generations of Indigenous people who have cared for these lands. This series is based on gender violence and trauma. It is essential that this work focus on the injustices that Indigenous and Métis and Inuit suffer too, and in particular, violence of against two-spirited and Indigenous women and girls. This webinar is in French and in English. You can choose the language of your choice at the bottom of your screen, and in order to listen to the webinar in the language of your choice, the slides are available in English and in French, and you can choose which language you'd like to see the slides in. It's a great pleasure for me to present today's speakers, Dr. Rosée Bruneau-Bhérer, who is a psychologist with children who are followed by CPS. She works with young people who have been neglected or abused and have sequelae from this abuse. We have with her Delphine Collin-Vézina, who is from McGill University. The research project of Dr. Collin-Vézina looks at the impact of negative events on young people and the services that they receive. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for being here. Now I'll let you go on with your presentation, and once the presentation is over, I'll ask you a few questions from the audience that we would ask you to respond to. So enjoy the presentation. Thank you very much, Céline, for this introduction, and welcome to this presentation called Rethinking Child Welfare Services, Trauma-Informed Approaches and used by the CPS. I'm Rosée, and I work with my colleague Delphine Collin-Vézina. I've worked with her since 2014, looking at approaches, trauma-informed approaches in the Quebec City region. So hello to all of you. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you, as I see that there are many people here. It seems to be a topic that a lot of people are interested in. We hope we'll have a great hour with you, and we'd like to answer your questions to Rosée, and I will try to give you the most central key messages, as well as a case study, which will enable you to see how this approach this situation and how trauma-informed approaches can be used in child protection. I'd also like to mention that Rosée and I are in different regions of First Nations, the First Nations of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And we try to include the First Nations in all our work. Rosée is in the Wendake area, and I'm from Montreal, where historically we have the Kanengehake people who were the first people here. I'd also like to thank the interpreters for French and English, and also for sign language, who are here today to make this presentation accessible to all. We're very thankful for the interpretation that you are hearing or seeing, so that people who don't, so that everyone can participate in this discussion. I realize that I don't have access to the slides, so I can't change them myself, but I got some instructions in the chat, so José, now would you like to, Rosée, would you like to explain the objectives? Do you see them in English or in French, the learning objectives? The interpreter is not getting any sound? Is there a problem with the sound? Okay. No, nothing's working on my side, says one of the speakers. Everything's frozen. What the idea is to reflect on the impact of traumatic childhood experience and a look at the attachment, self-regulation, and competency model. And then we're going to talk about Jeremy, a case study to talk about clinical issues that Delphine is going to bring up throughout the presentation. So I hope that you can now hear me. Rosée, could you confirm that we can hear you? Yes, yes, yes. So I see the presentation in English, even though I wanted to get it in French, but that's not a problem. We work in both languages. So we wanted to start by explaining to you the major principles of the trauma-informed approach before going into the ARC approach. This is the model that we use, the model that has made a huge difference in our way of seeing services, not just psychotherapy for children who are exposed to trauma, but it's also a much broader way, a much more systematic way to see how we work with children and adolescents who've been exposed to violence, and to bring everyone into this trauma-informed approach. What we know is that a trauma-informed approach is an approach that tries, it's an approach, it's not psychotherapy. We're thinking what we do is use an approach towards the young population to influence policies and practices by helping practitioners to understand the prevalence of trauma. We also want to take the time to understand and recognize the impact of trauma in the lives of children and young and youth, and to be really committed to incorporating this knowledge into policies, not just let this knowledge float around and not really use it. We really want to integrate it into our work so we can change practices and also policies and procedures used in organizations. So that's what we'd like to talk to you about today. Now we can change slides, please, on to the next one. Thank you. So just to continue on this idea, when we talk about trauma-informed approaches, it's important to remember the idea of the 4 Rs rule, which works quite well in French and in English. So each organization has the means to develop practices that are that focus on trauma. There are 2 terms that are used in French, but it's really just in English, trauma-focused or trauma-informed care. It's a little bit hard to translate it perfectly into French, but so the 4 Rs is to make sure that we, for instance, give training, clinical support, and professional development activities so that professionals can develop these 4 Rs to realize the impact of trauma and the importance of not just focusing on rehabilitation, if you will, but in the way that we work with children, we need to develop a vision of a repair, of reparations and healing, recognize signs and symptoms of trauma, and have the means to be able to identify what kinds of difficulties appear that are linked to trauma. There are mental health names for them, but Are we right using these terms when we're working with young people, or could trauma-focused practices help us to identify the signs and problems that our clients have? And as professionals, as caregivers, as parents, or foster families too, everybody involved in the system. And do we have the means to respond and give services to our clients? Can we we need to fully integrate trauma knowledge into what we do? And do we have strategies to limit or at least reduce or abolish practices that unfortunately could reactivate new trauma or could be very damaging to children? So I just wanted to open a little parenthesis before we go on. Rosée is going to talk about what they're doing in Quebec City, the group that we work at the CIU SSS. So these 4 rules aren't applied in very quickly. You have to think about really giving a lot of training so people can develop expertise in the communities of practice, psychodevelopmental communities. This is not a magic wand that we're giving you today. It really is something that an organization has to use consistently to see the effects on young children in difficulty. Okay, so I can control the English slides at least, and or at least I see them, and I think we'll be able to move forward. Okay, here we go. I was a bit too fast. So now I'm going to give the floor to my colleague so she can give us some information on this little boy, Jeremy, who's going to come with us throughout this presentation. Thank you very much, Delphine. So today I'm going to talk to you about Jeremy. He's a little boy. He's 9 years old. He's a fictional case, but it was inspired by many young people that I met in my practice, either as a psychotherapist working with individuals or in my role as a clinical support or consultant that where I work with group homes. And they meet a lot of children who are similar to Jeremy. A report was made regarding abuse by his maternal grandfather. He was previously involved in sexual games in the bathroom, and he was found, and the disclosure happened. And that's when he started talking about the abuse. He's a child who's had a lot of school problems and social problems. He's failing in a lot. He's also done 1 year over again. He doesn't have any friends at all, and he opposes to what he's oppositional, he's irritable, he's lazy, he can even sometimes become violent, and people have trouble understanding the intensity of his reactions at home and also in the school and also at home. He's been he was in a foster family for a year when they learned about the sexual problems, and he had to testify before the camera to denounce his abuser and to his foster family has known him for about 12 months, but they don't know really how to create a relationship with this child or understand him and try to calm him down. So the day of the filmed interview, he's not collaborating at all. He's very uncomfortable. He starts to scream. He threatens to leave. He kicks the furniture, and then he curls up into a ball, and he ignores what the professionals are talking to him. They only have partial information on his situation, and they're a bit surprised by his reactions, these intense reactions. And they might tend to focus on his bad behavior. He may look like delinquent, maybe he has oppositional problems, PTSD, sexual issues, especially when you think of why he disclosed the abuse. So you have to remember when you use this trauma-informed approach that these behaviors, even though they're disturbing, are in reaction to trauma, either simple or complex trauma. Maybe this is just the tip of the iceberg, and it means that we should dig a little bit further. Now, how can these trauma-informed approaches help the teachers and the foster family to better interpret Jeremy's behavior, which masks legitimate behavior? He's obviously very uncomfortable. How can he be calmed down? How can we help him to use his own professional resources to manage his emotions and to work and to collaborate with this difficult interview, which is very important for him, and which is also important for the professionals and for society, which wants to protect potential victims of sexual abuse. This is if a non-trauma informed approach is used and it just focuses on his behavior, he will be stigmatized, and maybe he'll end up worse off, and this will crystallize problems that he already has. You can put yourself in his shoes to meet his, to understand him and act as a system, as adults, as caring adults, to avoid re-traumatizing this child. We really have to understand what's going on and not misinterpret what's happening. He is just having trouble reacting to what's happening to him. Thank you very much, Rosée, for the beginning of this presentation. We'll follow his story over the next hour. And now the question is that we're interested in is Jeremy, does he have a unique story? Is this a rare case? A child who's got a background which is very sad, but rather uncommon. Now, if you're working in child protective services, you know that this is much more frequent. But if you work more with youth programming or children in difficulty, you may see children with behavioral problems and anxiety, children who don't come to you because they've been traumatized or abused. So the question is this something that happens often in society? Is it prevalent or not? So the number here you see may surprise you in terms of prevalence. If you were hoping that this is relatively rare, when you look at the situation in Canada, you can see what we have here is the best study that we have. It's this study was done by Tracy Afifi, one of my colleagues, and she used the Canadian Community Health Survey, Mental Health, which was done 10 years ago. The questions are not asked that often in populational surveys. So this is representative of the national population. And when 3 questions are asked to Canadians over 18, have you experienced sexual abuse in your physical abuse, or were you exposed to intimate partner violence before you were 18? These are only certain types of traumas rather. 1 person out of 3 says they've had these experiences before the age of 18. So this is not rare. This number right away shows us that you can no longer believe it's rare. It is a problem that affects all of us, no matter what area you work in. We're going to concentrate on youth protection here, but no matter where you work, maybe you work in a school, for instance, if you think of a classroom, 1 child out of 3, that's a lot of children when you think about it. And it means a lot of children could be affected by this reality. And we're just identifying 3 types of trauma. So in this context, what we wanted to do was to make you think about complex trauma. How are we to understand the reality of these children growing up in an environment of interpersonal trauma, trauma between people, often between trauma coming from a person who's important to the child, physical trauma, sexual trauma, intimate partner violence. And these are types of trauma that are caused by people who are close to the child and with whom the child has a trusting relationship. So there's the idea of betrayal, how these actions do not respect the integrity of the child. We also talk about complex trauma when you talk about repeated or prolonged actions. Perhaps the better way of thinking of this is children who every day might have experience a traumatic event. So the child is always on the lookout, and they're afraid when the door opens at home. Is my parent going to scream? And if he screams, it's because he's drunk too much. And maybe this might bring about violence. There's a cascade of events. So opening the door for this child, when the door is open, the child feels that this wakes up a reaction in the child, fear that something might happen, some violence might happen. So when it's repeated, it doesn't necessarily happen that often, but does it happen over a long period of time? And is this period, this feeling of insecurity, is it prolonged too? It involves direct harm. There are people who are supposed to take care of the child, support them, give them encouragement, and be kind to them, and make them feel safe. These people, unfortunately, do things to the children and harm the child's development and harm his or her psychological development. And this happens at a developmentally vulnerable time. It's not just 5 or 6. We've gone beyond the idea that everything important happens before 5 years old. Of course, more there's abuse early in life, more the sequelae can be serious. But there's no time in a child or a youth life when being exposed to violence does not affect the child. Unfortunately, the violence leaves its imprint on the child and youth. And of course, when you when you become an adult, you have been harmed. So we want to, let's compare this with a pregnant woman. She might be in a car crash and have a problem, but what you see here are traumas that come up over time, and traumas that are less interpersonal. It's not someone who talks badly about another person. It's often people say I was at the wrong place at the wrong time, but there's a social reaction that is produced. When something happens, the police come, the emergency medical services come. But when there's a trauma, like in the case of Jeremy, he doesn't necessarily want to talk about everything that happened to him all at once. And he has all kinds of reasons to keep part of his story hidden. Children disclose, but bit by bit, they feel stigmatized. There's shame. There's a feeling of responsibility for the situation. And so this brings us to the first R we referred to. How, as a society, how you as professionals, as a group, always realize what kind of trauma has taken place and the extent that that children carry it with them. For many children, and statistics show that there are many of them, it's not the majority, but many children have rocks in their backpacks. It slows down their development. It's not like children who come to school with a backpack filled with wonderful memories. So what kinds of experiences do children and youth accumulate? Think of the children that you work with, and think of this first question that comes up and not the last question. Think about what they've lived through right off the bat. So, which brings us back to Jeremy. Thank you, Delphine. One of the first steps when we use these trauma-informed approaches, we look at the experiences, the life experiences of these children, and to rewind, to look at when these children were born, how they developed, so to understand why their behaviors are just the tip of the iceberg. When we ask people who've known Jeremy for a while, we realize that he's experienced instability, negligence, and he's been exposed to intimate partner violence in his biological family between 0 and 7 years. It's a long period of time. When this situation was revealed, he was moved out of his family for his safety to his maternal grandparents. Maybe, and that's where incest came into play. He was there for 6 to 8 years. He was there from 6 to 8. He was angry and he behaved in a difficult way. He was put into a foster family, and they could not calm him down and fulfill his needs.
So he had to be transferred again in another family, and he's been there for 12 months. So we can see that not only has there been trauma and sexual abuse in his body, but he's also developed throughout various adverse effects in his life, various adverse events in his life, which have affected his development and his reactions to stress. And even though Jeremy is in a family who's competent, who loves him, he's been there for 12 months, it would be unrealistic to think that this is enough time to be able to deform everything that's been, that he's known his whole life, that it's enough to heal his wounds and allow him to recuperate. It takes longer than that to find new ways of seeing oneself, to find new ways of perceiving one's own environment, to interact with others, and especially to self-regulate. And we also learned that Jeremy was returning to his maternal grandparents' family one weekend over 2. So that's a survival mechanism that has developed, so that he could confront the dangers. There was chaos. He was around people who had harmed him. So he had developed strategies that were useful to him, and he couldn't set them aside because he needed them one weekend out of 2 until just recently, actually, in fact, until just yesterday. So he couldn't be soothed. So let's have a child who doesn't have complex trauma. And during the assessment of a sexual abuse report, and I don't want to minimize the impact of sexual abuse on a child's development. It can be major, but let's say that a child doesn't have a complex trauma prior to the incident. He has a simple trauma. It happens once in his life. He'll have a different kind of baggage, something different, something external, and he'll be using different strategies to be facing life. For example, he's probably with his biological family. He's been able to become attached to them. It's a secure attachment. His family can decode him, can appease him, because they know this child. They've known him since he was born. They won't, doubt what the child says. He'll be believed almost systematically by his family, and he'll be supported through his through this situation. There will also be internal resources. For example, he'll have a better self-esteem, better capacities, better competencies, better capacity to manage big emotions like the stress that we're talking about today. So we can see that for Jeremy. He's coming there. He's not very well equipped to handle everything. The foster family is not able to appease him. They can't really reach him. So this means that the procedures that are usually stressful for everyone make it insurmountable. Jeremy just can't do it. And he shows it through his behaviors. He's oppositional, he's aggressive, or even he turns into himself. And it's hard. It's hard for the trauma team. You know, they're going to have to take a step back and try and better understand what's going on, try and use diverse strategies to appease Jeremy, soothe him, and enable him to reach his internal resources so he can get through the stress. These interventions have to be specialized, they must be trauma sensitive, and they have to take into account the complexity of Jeremy's situation. Of course, you know, we can think of Jeremy, his heavy baggage, as Rosée was mentioning. We're basically in a sexual abuse situation, but also in a context where there's been so many events that have been hard for Jeremy. There's been instability in his life, and he's still not in a stable spot. So we could think that through his exposure to various traumas, this is a child that might present with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about the aftermath. We've talked about the events. We've talked about the prevalence of everything. But what are we seeing? Obviously, you know, this is a disorder that we see in children and teens, and that could manifest itself in simple trauma as well as complex trauma. So it could be a one-time event and something more serious, or it could be chronic interpersonal life events that bring about you know, certain traumas. So really complex trauma can lead to PTSD. How will that show up in children? You know, basically the same way that it would show up in adults. Let's think of people who are coming back from war, or whose house has burnt down and they were scared for their life. Well, a child can fear for his life in a real sense, or when it comes to psychological integrity, because the child is vulnerable. Children, especially young children, aren't able to answer their own needs. So generally, they find themselves frozen in situations that create a lot of fear, terror even. So for these children, we might be able to observe that the aftermath are very concrete when we're talking about PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, you know, images that are coming back without it being wanted, invading thoughts. It can also be avoidance strategies, you know, trying to avoid people, places, all sorts of things that could bring the contact with a traumatic event. That's more or less what Jeremy's doing when he doesn't want to talk about what's happened to him, when he refuses to participate in the assessment, the investigation. We could think that he has a lot of avoidance strategies that he's using so that he can survive psychologically. Finally, everything that's a marked alteration in activations. You know, he's always hypervigilant. He's always watchful. He's always trying to make sure that an event he's always trying to see if an event will come up. So even though Jeremy is now in a foster home and there's no abuse being committed against him, he's still hypervigilant. And unfortunately, this hypervigilance follows him everywhere. You know, he also suffers from depression, anxiety. The concept of the world is also altered in his mind. So to come back to the PTSD, you know, when I studied teens at a rehabilitation center, you know, teens between 14 and 17 that were in group homes, mostly for behavioral issues, behavioral disorders. You know, in Quebec, Child Protection Services allows us to intervene for behavioral issues that are serious. This is unique to Quebec. Other provinces don't allow this kind of intervention under the Child Protection Acts. But these were youth that were placed because of their behaviors. And when we asked them if they had lived traumas in their lifetime, well, obviously they had a huge baggage. And 25% of those youth had clinical levels of PTSD. So that could indicate a disorder, but none of them had what was indicated in their file. So we want to make sure that we know that youth can present a lot of different difficulties and disorders, and the assessment of PTSD can pass under the radar. So this allows us to present you a video that was done in collaboration, as you see, between the Alberta Family Wellness Center and PALIX, an organization. This is a video that is available online. It's we love it. It has a great quality, and you know, it can really show what toxic stress can do, going beyond PTSD. There's more than PTSD out there. So happy visioning. The interpreters are shutting down.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two, from eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
Thank you very much. I hope that you were able to get sound. So basically, if you were in the original audio, you couldn't hear audio, but then you had to choose French, and at that point you got the audio. So I hope that if you weren't able to hear it, you'll be able to watch it at another time. As you can see, it's a short video, but it could be interesting. You know, it helps to remind us to which extent it affects the work that we do with complex trauma. It really affects the architecture of the brain. So these two organizations have decided to focus on the brain, and with reason, because that's what controls everything. But overall, it's the child's overall development that we're targeting. So here you have the entanglement of impacts, everything that's affected by the complex trauma. You know, we're going beyond looking at symptoms of PTSD. And I think if there's an important message to remember is that what extent we have to look at all of the functioning areas for the child. So I'll read them quickly. You know, you'll see that we have some references at the end. So you'll be able to have access to the slides. You know, you'll be able to see the book that we've written with our two colleagues on complex trauma, how to understand, assess, and intervene. So this is a model that we've presented, but it really comes from the scientific literature. So I'll list them quickly because we don't have a lot of time, but let's remember that complex trauma will have interpersonal traumas suffered in childhood. For example, there could be relational problems and attachment. How can we trust our relationships with others when we've been affected through these incidents? Is it possible to believe that we're able to turn towards others, that they can be our safety base? Identity and self-concept that's altered. How will that change the perception that the child has of himself? It will also influence his self-esteem, the value that he feels he has, the way that he can perceive himself and dream of himself. Somatization and physiology, you know, there are so many resources done through research that enables us to understand the toxic impact of the overproduction of stress hormones and how cortisol, you know, thankfully we have it if we're actually in danger, you know, it helps us to run away. But unfortunately, what does it do to a child's brain when that cortisol is produced in huge quantities? We know that this has extremely negative side effects. Some of the brain's functions aren't optimized, and some sections will basically stay in a development phase instead of developing and optimizing fully. There is also some somatization. There's also somatization problems. Children that have dysfunctional behaviors are children who can act one way, and these ways aren't approved by society. They don't correspond to what our expectations are towards societal behaviors, and they can be hard to understand. You know, a child will be criticized slightly for his life, but, you know, he's gone through moments of crisis, and, you know, it takes us hours to calm him down. And sometimes we see reactions that are like over the top or aggressive. So there's dysfunctional behaviors, but we have to tend to them because, as you can see, that's one area among 9 areas. It's not the only areas, but that's what's important to remember when we're dealing with these traumas. Children will have cognitive and learning problems. Cognitive when it comes to executive functioning, their capacity to organize themselves in a social world, their capacity to reflect, to learn from their mistakes, to have, you know, that little inner voice that helps you regulate yourself. So that really belongs to executive functioning. Some children have problems with emotional response and emotional regulation. Sometimes they don't have the words to explain what they're living. They don't have the strategies to regulate themselves. They're like a ball of emotion. and they have very few means to really try and keep their hands on the wheel. Some children will present dissociation and avoidance. Dissociation, when you can't fight or flight, then you have one other solution, which is to flee when these incidents are happening. So we might not be fully in dissociation. It's really the inverse of full consciousness. When it comes to attributions and understanding of the world, this will change how the children perceive the world where they grow up. You know, children have a certain naivete. They're able to believe that happiness does exist around them, that people are kind. But unfortunately, these are children that learn quite quickly that behind a smile, there could be someone who wants to abuse them. Behind a parent who is angry, there could be a parent who could dysregulate and become violent. So what does that change as a vision of the world? And lastly, mentalization, our capacity to really be able to be in our own perception, but understand someone else's perception, tolerate how they feel. So those cognitive processes allow us to be in relationships. It gives us a way of really settling into our relationships, and children have difficulties with that. So we'll come back to this with Jeremy shortly. But, you know, it's possible that you're thinking, you know, basically everything that we have in our diagnosis, in our DSMs, in our manuals for diagnosis, well, is it trauma? Is it a mental health issue? You know, the question, what's really there is that we won't be able to answer this question today because it's a complex question. But what research states is that there are distinctions. For example, ADHD, because we all know that this is the biggest diagnosis received by children and teens, is the one that's most prevalent. And so there's really an exercise that's done in literature to try to set some boundaries or limits as to what corresponds to trauma. So basically characteristics that would be more, would be closer to traumatic responses. What corresponds more to neurodevelopmental disorder as ADHD, and what symptoms overlap, where we really have a hard time distinguishing which belongs to where. So here, let's remember that it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other, but when a child has mental health issues that correspond to certain diagnoses, but we also know that the child has had a hard life, he has a heavy baggage, let's take the time to, you know, for that one child to try and see what seems to correspond with the trauma, what seems to correspond with mental health, what's the overlap. Let's really take the time to decide that the diagnostic might be true, but there's a lot of trauma behind it that would explain a lot of the symptoms that we see. So Rosée, back to you. Let's talk about Jeremy. Thank you, Delphine. Yes, it's a very complex exercise. Let's not reduce these kids' realities to some diagnosis. But in our society, a diagnosis gives access to certain services. So it would also be a mistake to just not diagnose anything. So let's take Jeremy's example. Let's try and see how we can, where the different difficulties we've already mentioned, how they could fit into our traumatic aftermath chart. So we know that he was raised in a negligent home. His needs weren't met consistently in a way that they could be predicted. There was IPV present, so that hindered his brain development. Basically, it developed differently than a child who didn't know these kinds of realities. So this means that there are neurobiological changes for him. And Jeremy has trouble concentrating at school. He can't make cognitive effort. He's described as being lazy, in fact. He's always vigilant, hypervigilant. You know, he uses strategies that were useful to him before this, so he could detect you know, a grandfather's step who might, or daddy's steps, who might be coming over, who might have drunk, and who might get violent with him. So we have that hypervigilance, which enabled Jeremy to pick up his toys in the living room really quickly so that he could go hide in his room and protect himself from a potential danger. Well, once he's at school, this is something that doesn't do him any good and might have brought learning troubles, cognitive issues. You know, he might not have been stimulated optimally in the first years of his life because his parents were struggling with personal issues that were taking everything over. And they definitely weren't available to show him what the colors are, teach him the alphabet, you know, teach him everything that a child would need to succeed at school. So basically, Jeremy has failure after failure since kindergarten. And then you put on top of that his life changes, the sexual abuse. He's really not ready to learn academically. We also know that attachment representations for Jeremy are probably insecure. So he believes, and with good reason, that people are threats. He doesn't trust people, he doesn't trust adults, and he could be rejected, he could be hurt one more time. So he's developed avoidance strategies so that he can keep his distance from people, protect himself once again. And these strategies have served him until now, because his difficult behaviors have meant that he's moved around and has meant that he's had to detach from people. So Jeremy's currently learning that it might be better to manage his own physical needs, his own emotional needs on his own, and that's unfortunate. So let's talk about association. There are certain reactions where Jeremy will turn into himself, and so that means that dissociation is possible. So when he remembers traumatic incidents, you know, basically we're causing him more stress when we're asking him to talk about these abuses. So his strategy to manage this could be dissociation. It's been useful in the past in various incidents that have happened to him, unfortunately, but it's also prevented him from building modulation strategies that might be more adapted, more efficient in today's world, and that would enable him to manage small, medium, and large emotions. You know, when you have extreme distress, when there's a real danger that's present, you use certain strategies. In Jeremy's case, once he's triggered by a perceived danger in his environment, you know, it could be someone's look, it could be a memory, could be a physical sensation, could be internal stimulus or an external stimulus that really trigger Jeremy's alarm system. Well, if dissociation comes aboard, that means he can't manage his emotions in a more adaptive manner, and he can't stay connected to the person he's with while he's living these stresses, experiencing these stresses. So we've talked about dissociation because we had to manage big emotions too often, and that brings about side effects up to an inability to regulate emotions and behavioral issues, because one of the only ways Jeremy has to release the stress is to have a tantrum, is to show that he's unhappy by hitting, by screaming, by rolling on the ground, and that enables him to regain his balance. It's an inappropriate way to manage his emotions, which are extremely intense. And that's because he doesn't have any other strategies, because he wasn't able to develop them because of what he's lived so far. So overall, this has probably brought impact on his identity. So if we think about sexual abuse, for example, Jeremy might have an over-sexualized part of him that was developed too early, that is lacking in social capacities and doesn't know how to have relationships with schoolmates. So maybe the sexual games he played in the bathroom at school could reflect the lack of self-esteem he has, or his sexualized identity that he's acquired, in addition to having societal barriers. So he needs to learn more useful manners of relating to others that enable him to make friends and be close to his schoolmates. His understanding of the world, what's right, what's wrong, could have been affected by the experiences he's had throughout his development. So we really see that we have a child who might not have reached his intellectual potential who, because of the experience he's had, he's not able to regulate his emotions. He has an insecure attachment style. So that obviously impacts mentalization, which is a function of a high level function, which is extremely important for making friends, for keeping friends. But, you know, when we're a child like Jeremy, who is super sensitive to rejection, who takes part in several conflicts with others, sometimes despite himself, well, this confirms the negative representation he makes of himself. And this will bring about distress, something that's hard to manage. And then there are hard behaviors, which will be an attempt to manage these emotions, but will bring about even more rejection. We can see that that cascade can turn quite a while if a trauma-sensible approach isn't used to go beyond the difficult behaviors. How are we going to help Jeremy stop the tantrums, the oppositional behaviors, but how will we enable him to develop more competencies that will be more adapted to society, to living in a more normative society, for example, in his foster family?
Thank you. Okay, Delphine. Yes. So I'm sure you're saying to yourselves, what do we do with a boy like this? And I just like to give a few key messages on trauma-informed approaches, and then we'll come back to Jeremy. We'll see what was done for this little boy who's a bit different, and bring him, make him more resilient. Trauma-informed approach is a new way of looking, not a new technique. It's not a new way of doing things, but it revolutionizes our way of looking at the child, at his background, the sequelae, what it's done to the child's development, and our way of looking at the child. First and foremost, it changes. So this idea of a new way of looking, I'd like you to think about this from 4 points of view. First of all, we want to make sure that we're not just focused on bad behavior. This bad behavior is, we have an intervention plan, we're working on the problematic behavior. So our focus, we focus a great deal on the behavior problem, which bothers people, but it doesn't really recognize the true story of the child. And the tip of the iceberg is, you can see it. You have to remember that you can't deny this behavior. It has to be recognized, and you can hope that it will be changed, but we'll be much more effective in changing it if we understand the child's story, how it was built up, and not just the behavior that bothers us. The second axis is, as Rosée said, we have to look at the needs that are there, that are hidden. Yes, there are children who manifest their issues in a certain way, a difficult way, a problematic way. But what is really there is a need, an unanswered need. And the child has a right to have his needs validated. And the child has a right to security, to be fed, and to be taken care of in their basic needs, the need for affiliation, the need to be loved. And when a child doesn't have these needs met on a constant basis, on a regular basis, it's not surprising that the child becomes very disorganized, and it becomes someone who's very hard to help. So what is the real need? And value their right to have the needs met. So no matter what we do, can we always aim to soothe these children who are in survival mode? Children who are in survival mode, can we give them as much soothing as we can when they're with us in our offices, individually with us? Can we help them in the classroom if you're a teacher? Can we help them if you work in a group home or in the foster home? Can we make sure that the child can calm down and understand that the dangers do exist. They're elsewhere. They still do exist. But within this space, this calm, serene, soothing, kind space, the child can put down their load and just be a child, and develop properly. So can we be soothers? Can we create sanctuaries for the children, no matter where we work? And finally, can we foster healthy empowerment? In a lot of our the places where we work, we insist on obedience, on authority. Even when you meet a child for an hour in your office, you have expectations. We want the child to comply with our expectations, with our rules, to talk to us, to tell us what's happened in the past week. We impose certain expectations and norms. Of course, these norms do exist and they are important to stress, but perhaps we should try to help these children to be empowered, to make decisions, healthy decisions, and use their agency and be a person with full rights, rather than fostering obedience, submission, because that's been too much a part of their lives. And even if today they seem to be oppositional, the reality is, in fact, in their abusive lives, they have never been able to fight back against the abuser, and it destroys something in the child. So it's important to give them back their empowerment. We are adults, because we're adults and we tell children what they're supposed to do. But in a trauma focused approach, we want to be more egalitarian. And we know that children rely on us, but we don't want it to be a battle of power. So at the beginning, I'd like to tell you why we fell in love with the ARC approach, this systemic approach. Of course, today, we're not going to give you an exhaustive overview of the approach, but we're trying to show you how, with Jeremy, this model can influence our way to interact with him. It was developed by a social worker and a clinician. You can see the book. Rosée, neither Rosée nor I invented this approach, but it has inspired what we do. And it is the basis on which we have developed our approach and what we do. This is a model called ARC. It's a model that is aimed at building resilience through three important vectors that support child development: attachment, self-regulation, and competencies. Here you have a simple view of the model, but this is perhaps the most important slide you'll see today. If you want to work with this lens, and if you want ARC to give you a structure to know what to look at, think of child services through this lens. It's not it's like a house and you go up from the basement. So in the basement, the foundation, there's engagement, education, routines, and rhythms. These are prerequisites to help children calm down. In terms of attachment, there are three things: caregiver affect management, empathetic adjustment, attunement, and effective response. In terms of regulation, we target the child. Before the other two levels, it was the service providers we concentrated on. But here, it's the child's toolbox who identifies and modulates their emotions. And then you move to competency with executive functioning, self-development and identity, and relational connection. And the goal of ARC is to gradually help the children to integrate their trauma. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're supposed to talk about the trauma. It depends on what your mandate is as a service provider, but we use the ARC model to work with people in rehab centers who are there to ensure the child is safe, and we try to help service providers to see how this model will help them to soothe the children. A psychotherapist can also use the ARC model. According to the role that you play, you can adapt the ARC model. You adapt it to your responsibilities, to your role with the child, but it gives everyone a common language. What I'd like to suggest is that we use the last minutes we have for Rosée to explain how the ARC model is used with Jeremy, and at the end, we'll give you some additional resources, and then we'll move on to your questions. Thank you very much, Delphine. And we won't have time today to look at each of these blocks, but let's stress certain basic concepts to give you some ideas, concrete ideas that perhaps you already use, but didn't realize it. We want to help you to understand why this technique or this attitude or this intervention philosophy, I would say, is effective with young people who have a complex trauma background, like Jeremy. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is routines and rhythms. This may seem simple, and it is. It's encouraging all the service providers, whether they see the child once or several times or regularly, to be very predictable in their actions. This allows the service provider to calm the hypervigilant service and to create some soothing, and it gives a message to Jeremy's fragile system that during this period of time, he is safe. He can lay his troubles down, and he can use his resources to learn something, what you would like him to learn. How do you do this? Very easily, by using the same room, the same time at the and the same day. And you start and end the meeting with a little ritual. For instance, a little game that only takes a minute at the beginning, at the end, or a drawing that you start at the beginning and that you finish at the end, or a special handshake that you've invented with the child and that you should always remember. So these are little things that you can integrate into the role that you play with the child, and that will enable with you to work on the child's emotional security. At home too, and in the school, it's essential that Jeremy learns that despite what he's experienced up to now, the human beings around him are generally kind and are going to try to fulfill his needs in a predictable way, which will enable him to get back on the right developmental trajectory that's better adapted to the world. Now, the next slide deals with attunement. Do you want to add anything, Delphine, before we go on? No, I just want to remind people that routines, you have to make sure that the routine gives a lot of relationship moments. Healing moments can be inserted, help the child organize his or her life, allow the child to have a little stuffed animal or something. All these things are anchors, or times when you can share that you can share with the child. They're not seen as therapeutic moments. They're moments that take place in ordinary life, but they're very important for children who've grown up in trauma and who are afraid of the dark, for instance, because maybe there was violence at home. What do you do with this child so that this child, bit by bit, can trust you and be able to fall asleep? That's what we want for children. Are adults sensitive enough to figure out the right routine, predictable routine. So even though this seems very basically parenting 101, there are amazing things that can be done. I've seen children who have laid down their sorrows when we finally found the right routine to support them, and they feel that they're helped by the adults rather than having behavioral expectations of them.
Thank you, Delphine. This really bridges what we wanted to talk about next, which is empathic adjustment and attunement. Let's see what's underneath the iceberg. Let's keep in mind when we're intervening with Jeremy that we have to be realistic with our expectations towards him, and that opposition, defiance, all of these, he's already adapted to several situations, and he won't be able to leave his survival kit aside just on a whim to adapt something new. This will have to be done progressively. So difficult behaviors that are adapted are a gold mine of information, even though it's not yet an acceptable manner of expressing your distress. But adults will be able to use the information to target the need, to respond to the need, even though his capacity to express it is under development and could actually shock people. That doesn't mean we accept any behavior. Some behaviors need to be accompanied, when there's violence, when the child is rude, when things exceed societal expectations. We have to correct them, but we do it with kindness. We tell him, we know that you can't do any better right now, but let's help you build new competencies, new aptitudes, because this is what will help you stop going towards violence when you're trying to regulate yourself. Yeah. Rosée, as adults, how can we position ourselves? How can we be less reactive towards behaviors and think, oh, you look really angry today. What's going on? What has made you so angry? To be able to, not necessarily give reason to the child for being angry, but we take note that he's angry. You're coming back from recess, you're in the classroom, nothing's working. Well, what's going on? Let's be curious. Let's want to explore what has happened. Obviously the child will do well if he can. He doesn't have bad intentions. And if we start having these kinds of words in our heads, let's go back to the baggage. Maybe there's something that we haven't seen that he's carrying. In Jeremy's case, it's easy to forget that he's got that baggage because he's acted in a sexual manner, and that makes us react, and it's valid what we're doing, but it's easy to forget how to look at him. Yes, and unfortunately, that's a block we won't be able to talk about, which is how affects can be managed. This is an approach to use as well in trauma. If adults around Jeremy are able to be conscious of their own reactions and to be adults who are well regulated, but behaviors can shock us. They can make us angry. We can disapprove of them quite loudly, but we need to remember that we need to be good role models for Jeremy, and we need to help him regulate his emotions instead of provoking him into something that will be more coercive because we feel powerless. Often what I see is that we have a tendency to become punitive, coercive when we feel helpless towards their behaviors. But being aware of that helps us not to react to our own emotions and to theirs. We ask kids not to act on their emotions. We have to make sure we do the same. Yeah, and it's not always easy. That's the reality. We have to be conscious of what our limits are. And we have to be kind and compassionate towards ourselves as parents, as human beings, as workers. So there's another realm of ARC. We've been giving examples. We went in the house. We took 3 examples from the house that we saw earlier to talk about Jeremy. So now we want to talk about modulation. Yes. So once Jeremy's learned to trust the system of caregivers around him, whether it be his foster family, the school system, everyone that surrounds him, and that he'll have learned that he he is worthy, he can receive positive attention, and his needs can be met in a regular manner. Well, at that point, we'll be able to ask him to try and modulate his emotions, to learn how to do it, to basically lower the volume so that he can reduce his physiological activation or increase it if need be. So we can think of a training exercise that we could suggest to Jeremy, even though he's oppositional and he might not want to explore new things necessarily. But once he feels more emotionally secure, he'll also be more open to trying new strategies to regulate his emotions. If we stick to his objectives, which might be to have fewer outbursts because he realizes that this really causes issues to making friends, well, then we can use his own goals, which might be different from the worker's objectives. Our objective for him could be different, but we can suggest strategies that are a little bit more physically intense and strategies that will enable him to relax a lot more. These usually give good results. For example, we can allow Jeremy to kick a ball as hard as possible, as often as he wants, in order to free up his stress, his aggressivity, his aggression, and which will enable Jeremy to stay in contact with his cognitive resources to be able to manage life's demands, at school, at home. It's not a privilege, it's not a reward, but on the contrary, Jeremy, for example, could have had a hard day. He's irritable, he's oppositional. Let's encourage him, let's accompany him so that he can use this way of literally emptying his bucket of tension and stress, and let him work on reducing the stress accumulation, which could result in an aggressive outburst, which would lead to all sorts of cascading consequences. And then we might want to register him to trauma-informed yoga. There's breathing, there's movement, there's meditation, and that can really help recalibrate his fragilized nervous system. It's efficient in the moment, and after the session he can use it, but also longer term it can help him make some neurobiological changes, and that will help him regulate his emotions when he'll be confronted to small stresses. We hope that's not going to, or when he's confronted to big stresses, and we hope that's not going to be often, but it could happen. So we want to get Jeremy to try different ways of controlling his emotions. This will help him learn better at school, create relationships with others in a way that's reciprocal, positive, and it'll help him build a social network that's his own. And that provides the most protection when it comes to mental health for children and teens, as well as adults. So there you go. We've covered some of the blocks. There could be so many other things that we could be adding to support Jeremy's resilience in the stress he has to live today, this week, and for the rest of the year, and even for the rest of his life, because integrating trauma is a long-term objective for a child who has such a life experience. Thank you, Rosée. So this enables us to see the various resources that we've talked about. We invite you to have a look at them. I hope that some will speak to you and will enable you to reflect further on the topic. And I know that Céline will ask us some questions from the audience. So I see that some questions are similar, so I'm going to regroup some of them in one question that means several things. We're asking us to specify the difference between complex trauma, developmental trauma, so the CPTSD that we hear a lot about. So in 1 minute. So the international ICM, which classifies disorders, introduced in 2018-2019 in the last version the disorder of PTSD, so complex PTSD, which is a new entry in the diagnoses and represents this clinical idea of complex trauma, also called developmental trauma. And so it's great news in the field. It's not a diagnosis in the DSM-5. So that means we still often hear several terms. So that's why we talked about various things today, but it's very distinct from PTSD. You know, we have relational trauma, complex trauma, developmental trauma. So there's the idea of complex PTSD, which is the diagnosis. That all of these terms speak to the same reality with a few nuances. Thank you, Dr. Vézina and Béra, for your very interesting presentation. We only have a few minutes left at the end of our webinar, so I will ask one question. We've had several questions. I thank the participants for all their questions. We've been able to answer some of them during the presentation. So two participants were asking if this model, this ARC model, can be adapted to trauma that's related to racialization, to being Indigenous or other. Go ahead. Well, thank you for that question, which is very important. So the ARC model emerged in a clinical context. It might have a few zones, but it probably won't recognize all the historical, intergenerational, and systemic traumas. So I would say that for me, the ARC is a good starting point, but there's still more reflection to be done to see how it can be adapted to make sure it's relevant to systemic traumas, traumas that are related to ethnic origins, for example. ARC didn't really explore that. And the second part of my answer is this. There's a lot of interest in adapting the ARC so that it's more culturally sensitive, so that it better recognizes and better collaborates with people from various environments and communities, so that it can recognize people's expertise within communities. For myself, you know, I have some affinities with the Inuit communities when it comes to adapting the ARC and having models that are trauma focused. I've also had other conversations with other communities in the First Nations communities. When we have this conversation in general, people from Indigenous communities remind me that ARC really brings to light things that have been recognized as being very important in several communities, things that resonate and that might have been forgotten in a Western context. Things that bring us back to feeling of belonging, relational experiences within communities. So our ARC still has a little ways to go to make sure it's relevant to various communities that have various realities. Thank you. Anything to add? Yes, thanks, Delphine, for your answer. I would add that the ARC model is an umbrella model. It's an integrative model that will allow us to target certain interventions that we're already finding efficient with our population, and we'll be able to adapt them to various contexts. For example, when we talk about attachment and we work on it, which is a universal concept, we obviously won't work at it the same way if we're working with First Nations, people who are either in their biological family or in their foster family. But the target will be the same, but the way of going about it could look like all sorts of things, depending on the context. Thank you. We would love to be able to answer more questions, but unfortunately, we have 1 minute left in our webinar. So thank you so much for answering the questions. Thank you to all the participants who have been here today. We are sharing a list of supports in the chat for those who wish to be supported after the chat. The next webinar will be on gender-based violence. This will be on October 6th from 1 to 2:30. We invite you to take part in it. There's a link that has been shared in the chat so that you can register should you wish to. And at the end of the webinar, there will be an assessment page that will appear in your navigator, in your browser. We appreciate your comments. because they will help us to decide on topics for future webinars. And then there's also another form that will allow you to access your participation certificate. So we'll be sending you the registration by email over the next few days. And you can always come to the Knowledge Center Hub to have access to the resources. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being there today.